Welcome to Unlocking the Dream Vision. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. In this video series, we will be exploring the mysterious dream vision of Enoch, as explored in my book, Unlocking the Dream Vision, The Secret History of Creation. In this video, we will take our first look at the Kingship and the First Temple. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below, and don't forget to subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. Within the dream vision, as we learned in our last video, that after the events of the great Exodus, we are told that the sheep came to a goodly place, a pleasant and glorious land, and that sometimes their eyes were open and sometimes blinded, till another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. This unassuming line covers a vast unknown amount of time that is primarily covered in the Bible's Book of Judges and the first book of Samuel, commonly known as the first book of the Kings. The Book of Judges covers the time between the ending of the events of the Exodus up to the time of Samuel, the last judge of Israel before the coming of the first kingship of the people of Israel. The actual amount of time that the Book of Judges covers is unknown. The Book of Judges is a collection of individual stories about individual judges that ruled over Israel during this vast unknown amount of time that have all been woven together to give the illusion of a continuous storyline. These judges were people that were raised up by their Lord God whenever the people of Israel turned away from the law and went a-whoring after other gods and corrupting themselves by worshiping and bowing to these other gods of the heathen. The judges would then be sent to the people of Israel by their Lord God to deliver them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. We are told that once these judges had delivered the people back to God and the law, they normally passed away shortly thereafter. After the death of the judge, we are told that the people would normally return and corrupt themselves more than their fathers, following other gods to serve them and to bow down unto them, which in turn would lead the Lord to raise up a new judge to deliver them all back to him and the law. This pattern repeats itself many times throughout the book of Judges up until the coming of Samuel. Samuel is the last judge of Israel. It is at this point that the Bible tells us that the tribes of Israel began to demand a king so they could be like the other peoples of the world. The Bible also tells us that their God tried to warn the people of Israel about wanting a king. For if they served a king, then he would turn away from them when their king turned against them. The tribes of Israel would not listen to the words of their Lord, and again demanded a king to rule over them and to judge them and to fight their battles. While these events are going on, we are told in both the Bible and the dream vision that the Morarites, which are represented by the dogs, and the Amorites, represented by the foxes, with the people of Edom, who are the descendants of Esau, also known as the black wild boars, work against the people of Israel. These events seem to be the primary driving force for the people of Israel wanting a king. It is also at this point we are told that God raises up a new leader for his people, a king. This first king of the people of Israel is known as King Saul. And sometimes their eyes were opened and sometimes blinded, till another sheep arose and led them and brought them all back, and their eyes were opened. And the dogs and the foxes and the wild boars began to devour those sheep, till the Lord of the sheep raised up another sheep, a ram from their midst, which led them. And that ram began to butt on either side those dogs, foxes, and wild boars, till he had destroyed them all. And that sheep whose eyes were opened saw that ram, which was amongst the sheep, till it forsook its glory, and began to butt those sheep, and trampled them, and behaved itself unseemly. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verses 41 through 44. After becoming king, after successfully defeating the enemies of Israel, both accounts tell us that King Saul abused his power and that they soon turned against his own people. The biblical account presents a king that slowly becomes more and more paranoid as his reign goes on. As King Saul slowly turns against his people, this leads the Lord God to appoint a new leader, or ram, to become king for his people. This is, of course, the legendary King David, possibly the most famous king of all time. The Bible goes into great detail in the life of King David, with as many troubles as being the new king of Israel and his work establishing the new nation of Israel. And the Lord of the sheep sent the lamb to another lamb and raised it to become a ram and leader of the sheep, instead of that ram which had forsaken its glory. And it went to it and spake to it alone, and raised it to being a ram, and made it the prince and leader of the sheep. But during all these things, the dogs oppressed the sheep, and the first ram pursued that second ram, and that second ram arose and fled before it. And I saw till those dogs pulled down the first ram, and the second ram arose and led the sheep. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verses 45 through 48. As with the Exodus before, the dream vision mirrors the biblical account almost perfectly. This also holds true for the next few verses leading up to the legendary, almost mythical King Solomon and the building of the first temple. The building of the first temple by King Solomon is one of the most important events, both religiously and politically, both for the Jewish and Christian faiths. It is also an important event to the esoteric religions, primarily Freemasonry. Within Freemasonry, the first temple, or as they refer to King Solomon's temple and citadel, is thought to be the ultimate representation of the builder's art, physically, spiritually, and symbolically. It's through this symbolic connection, which is based upon the original Masons that built the first temple of King Solomon, that modern-day Freemasonry claims its secret knowledge. It is also presented as their foundation story for the origin of their belief system. But as we've already learned, this assumption is incorrect. The tradition of Freemasonry and the esoteric religion in general is rooted much more in the traditions of the ancient scribes than any mysterious group of ancient stonemasons. But as you will learn, there is some truth to the claims made by the Masons. You also begin to learn that there is some truth to the general idea that they hold some secret knowledge about this building that the general public is completely unaware of. To begin this leg of the journey of the mysteries, we must first return to the next set of verses within the dream vision. And those sheep grew and multiplied, but all the dogs and foxes and wild boars feared and fled before them, and that ram butted and killed the wild beasts. And those wild beasts had no longer any power among the sheep, and robbed them no more of aught. And that ram begat many sheep, and fell asleep. And a little sheep became a ram in its stead, and became prince and leader of those sheep. And that house became great and broad, and it was built for those sheep. And a tower lofty and great was built on the house of the Lord of the sheep. And that house was low, but that tower was elevated and lofty. And the Lord of the sheep stood on that tower, and they offered a full table before him. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verses 49 and 50. These verses of the dream vision parallel the biblical account of King David and King Solomon almost exactly. What might be surprising to many is the references to a tower being built upon that house that became great and broad. This tower has led to several misconceptions, primarily because all sides have gone to great lengths to remove this part of the story, even though it is in the biblical text. Additionally, the problem is the fact that within the biblical text, this tower is not referred to as a tower, but is in fact known as the great porch of the temple. In order to begin understanding the importance of this tower, we must return to the biblical account of the building of King Solomon's first temple, which is contained within 2 Chronicles 3, 4, and 1 Kings 6 and 3. We'll find that we are given the exact dimensions of this great porch or lofty tower that made up this monumental structure. Within the Bible, we are told that it was 120 cubits high, which is approximately 240 feet, and was built over the entrance to the sanctuary of the temple. This entrance or vestibule was 20 cubits long and 10 cubits broad, which is approximately 40 feet by 20 feet. It is through this great porch that the priests of the first temple were admitted to the holy sanctuary. This great porch of the first temple that is described in the Bible is the same tower that is described in the dream vision as being elevated and lofty, and that the Lord of the sheep stood upon that tower. We're also told in both books of Chronicles and Kings that upon completion of the building of the first temple, it was dedicated in a massively large ceremony that was led personally by King Solomon, which soon after the great Lord or God came down from the heavens and stood upon the great porch. After King Solomon had performed his prayer, his blessing, and the mighty sacrifices for the great dedication ceremony of the temple, we are told in chapter 7, verse 3 of 2 Chronicles that all the children of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house. We're also told that the glory of the Lord filled the temple and that none could enter while the glory of the Lord was present. This is a remarkable detailed description of the symbolic description given within the dream vision that the Lord of the sheep stood upon the tower and they all offered a full table before him. But before we can move on, we need to take a moment to properly understand the symbolic meaning of the word glory as it's used in the description of the glory of the Lord filled the temple. When it's used in this manner, its symbolic meaning is rather simple, that is referring to the great brightness normally thought to be related to heavenly bodies. In this case, we are symbolically being told that the Lord God came down from the heavens as a great bright light and stood upon his tower. He then filled the temple with this same bright light that was upon the porch of the great temple. What is important to understand here is this is the stereotypical way the great gods of heaven interacted with their human followers, our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors. It appears that all the ancient cultures from all around the world speak of either the high places or mighty towers that reached up to heaven that the gods came and stood upon in some fashion. As you can imagine, this was all done by the gods so that they could show how great their power was over their lowly human subjects. It was also done to receive the great sacrifices made by the people in the religious temples of the gods. This forms a very effective system of control over our ancient Cro-Magnon man ancestors who just did not have the mental capacity to understand the great glowing God that came down from the heavens and stood upon the high places was nothing more than an advanced ship. Once you can realize and accept this idea, you can begin understanding for the first time that the primary reason for all the great ceremonial sacrifices that our ancient ancestors performed to the gods was so that the gods could come and retrieve the resources from their human slaves. In addition, these great ceremonies and rituals normally occurred during the phase of the new moon, a time when the night is the darkest because the moon is never seen in the night sky at that time of the month. The added darkness of a moonless night would only add to the lighting effects, making the gods appear even more dramatic to the people on the ground. We can now begin to easily understand that something like this would have had a massive impact on our Cro-Magnon man ancestors who witnessed it. It would have such an impact that they recorded it not only in writing, but also symbolically in their images. This is where we begin to take our next step into the mystical symbolism and how this story has been hidden within plain sight. You also begin to understand that you are already very aware of many of the elements we will begin exploring. To begin understanding this next step into the symbolism, we must first take a look at several ancient artifacts that you may or may not be familiar with. These artifacts are known as cylinder seals and have been found in almost all the ancient civilizations of the Near and Middle Eastern areas of the world. A cylinder seal is typically a small round stone cylinder, normally about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in length, which have been engraved with either written characters or small figurative scenes, with most of them having both. They were used in ancient times to roll an impression onto wet clay or sand. It is believed that these cylinder seals were first invented and used by the people of southern Mesopotamia. Scholars think they evolved into the invention of cuneiform and using clay tablets. The cylinder seals themselves were made out of a variety of different stones. There are also numerous cylinder seals that have been made out of glass and ceramics, which appear to have been engraved after they were made. Since the land of ancient Mesopotamia lacks good stone for carving, it is thought that the stone was imported from other areas, with southern Iran being one of the most probable sources of the stone. The majority of these ancient cylinder seals have a small hole drilled through the center of the cylinder. It is believed that the hole would allow it to be worn as a necklace, so they were readily available when needed. Scholars have traditionally interpreted these cylinder seals as some type of administrative tool, possibly as a form of signature or as jewelry. Scholars also believe that they were used as magical amulets, and later versions employing notations of cuneiform. In the later period of Mesopotamian civilization, they appear to have been used to notarize multiple impressions of clay documents by higher officials. Also at this time, we begin to find the cylinder seals being included within grave sites and being housed important items of clay tablets and gold and silver and gems. Scholars have argued that the images depicted on the cylinder seals are mostly theme-driven, most often with a sociological or religious context. Most studies of the seals primarily focus on the idea that the seals present ideas of the society in a pictographic and text form. It is generally accepted that the seals are independent of each other and do not tell a single continuous story. The vast number of seals that do appear to tell a continuous story are normally related to the Epic of Gilgamesh or other well-known events related to other great civilizations of the ancient world. But as you will now begin to learn and see with your own eyes, this entire theory put forward by scholars is incorrect. You also begin to learn that the ancient cylinder seals are the next key to understanding not only the mystical symbolism, but that they are actually the origin of many of the symbols we see. The scholarly idea that the cylinder seals do not tell a single continuous story is our starting point to understanding this part of the puzzle. The truth is, the ancient cylinder seals do tell a continuous story. Not only do they tell a continuous story, but as you will soon begin to learn and see with your own eyes, it is in fact a version of the symbolic dream vision of Enoch that we've been exploring. Once you begin to understand that the ancient cylinder seals do in fact tell a single story, you can begin understanding the true nature and use of the seals. These ancient cylinder seals would be worn as necklaces, which then would be used to help tell a story. When you grasp this idea, then it's incredibly easy to envision how a great teacher or philosopher who moved from town to town, retelling and teaching the story, normally for a small fee, with the help of these many little beads that had tiny detailed pictures on them. As the teacher told the story, he would roll out each little picture into soft clay as he came to that part of the story. This allows you to realize that the cylinder seals were in fact a type of oral picture book. This is an absolutely ingenious idea from our ancient ancestors. They could simply carry a whole storybook around their necks as a necklace. This would explain why so many of these ancient artifacts have been found over the years. It is because they were a common teaching tool, and anybody who had any type of education or wealth would most likely have a set. Then over the years, as the original civilizations fell apart or the cultures collapsed and disappeared, the necklaces were broken up as they were passed down through families or from teachers to students. Over time, people began forgetting what they were originally created for, with them slowly being used as seals to represent higher social status. They also appear to be used as signs of wealth by higher officials at this point. One of the crucial things to understand about the dream vision being the story that is told on the ancient cylinder seals is that they are similar to how the symbolic dream vision relates to the biblical story. There are scenes on several of the seals that do not appear to be either in the dream vision or the Bible. just as there are events in both accounts that do not seem to appear on the seals, or at least the ones that are publicly available. The truth appears that all the sources, the Bible, the dream vision, and the ancient cylinder seals, are fragmented parts of the same story, with each of them containing the basic symbolic elements that is common to all three. It is the secret of the ancient mystical symbolism of the scribes that ties them all together. This first cylinder seal, as you can see here, contains many of the important symbolic elements that we have already explored up to this point in time. It will also begin introducing you to a few new symbols that will help you begin to better understand the relationships between them. In addition, you will also begin to learn the secret and importance of the towers and the gods that once stood upon them. The key to understanding this first cylinder seal is to keep the story of King Solomon's temple with its great dedication ceremony and its symbolic description in the dream vision in mind. If we do this and we look at this cylinder seal, it is easy to begin identifying several of the symbolic elements we have already touched upon. The first item to point out is the primary focus of the image, the great tower-like structure in the center, which resembles a great spear. When we view this with the dream vision in mind, we can see and begin to realize that this is a symbolic image of the tower, lofty and great, that was built upon the house of the Lord of the Sheep. We can also see the low house that it was built upon. Additionally, we can see a small king-like figure sitting upon a throne and sitting upon some type of mysterious animal just to the right of the low house and the lofty tower it was built upon. We will take a closer look at these mysterious animal figures in later videos, but at the moment, the important thing to understand is that when compared to the symbolic dream vision and the biblical account of the dedication ceremony of King Solomon's temple and citadel, the cylinder seal appears to be clearly showing us a part of this great dedication ceremony of the lofty tower built upon a low house. The next symbolic item on this seal is the three larger figures, with two of them appearing to be male and the other in the center appearing to be female. These are a symbolic representation of the three different god factions. You can also see the three symbols of these gods in the upper part of the image over each of these gods. These are the three most common symbols for representing the three ancient gods. Going from left to right, the first symbol is of the crescent moon, the second in the center is the winged solar disk, and finally on the right, the eight-pointed star symbol. The eight-pointed star symbol, as we've already learned, is related to the great heaven and the God that ruled from there, as we have learned up to this point of the story, is the Lord God of the Bible. The crescent moon symbol has traditionally been associated with the mother goddess, while the winged solar disk, as we can see in this image, is a poor representation of the traditional solar disk symbol that is associated with the great Lord of Light. In this next image here, we can see the more traditional way these three symbols appear on the ancient artifacts. One of the most important factors to understanding these three symbols of the gods is how they are used in relationship to one another. When they are shown separately from each other, as we saw in the first image, it is symbolically represents that the gods are politically independent of each other and more or less working as equals. When they are shown very close to one another, as we will soon see, they are showing us a political alignment between those two factions. Commonly, as we will see in the future, it will be the crescent moon symbol shown in relationship with one of the other two symbols, with the pairing of the solar disk symbol appearing to be the most common. The next important thing is to understand that all the different gods of the three primary factions use these towers or high places to normally interact with their human slaves. Surprisingly, there are a number of different towers that are shown on the ancient artifacts. In addition, there are many different myths, legends, and folklore about these temples or towers of the gods that inform us that each temple or tower typically fulfilled one unique function. Some were known for places of healing, others were known of being places of knowledge where the gods answered their questions, while still others were places of worship and sacrifices where the gods themselves would come down and stand upon them. What is remarkable is that many of these towers, as they are symbolically shown on the ancient artifacts, appear to have a unique weapon-like power associated with them that was believed to be directly associated with the gods themselves. There are numerous myths, legends, and religious stories where it is said that the gods or God controlled the weather or unleashed plagues upon the people through these temples or towers. These small differences between the towers and their unique godly power is what is reflected symbolically on the artifacts, as can be seen in the following image. These are some of the more common symbolic representation of the ancient towers that the gods stood upon from numerous ancient artifacts. One of the greatest secrets to understanding why towers are still so very important to the followers of the esoteric religion to this very day is because they are very powerful symbolic representations of these ancient towers that the gods once stood upon. The towers are a massive symbolic symbol of the power, the wealth, the knowledge, and the unquestioned authority of the gods. They are monumental tributes to the almost forgotten age when the mighty gods themselves stood upon their lofty towers and their high places, far above and removed from the lowly humans below. Although much of this has been forgotten in the Western world, India, because of Hinduism, still remembers these towers, and it is reflected in their temples, as you can see in the following images. Amazingly, as you can see, these temples show the god standing upon the tower, normally surrounded by flames, just as we've seen described in the biblical story and the dream vision. Now you can easily understand that the towers of today are simply the largest and most visible symbolic representation of the ancient towers of the all-powerful gods that once stood upon them and the ancient people who followed them. One of the most important and common symbols of the tower can be seen in the first image in the bottom right, traditionally known as the Tree of Life by scholars. But as you should now be able to begin understanding, this is not a symbolic representation of the Tree of Life, but is in fact a symbolic representation of a tower that an all-powerful God once stood upon. This will become more apparent in the next cylinder seal, as you can see here. This cylinder seal gives us a much clearer view of the tower. Within this image, you can clearly see the central support structure with additional structures supporting the outer covering of the tower. We can also see a god standing upon it. In this case, as you will quickly learn, is actually the Lord God of the Bible. For you to understand this connection, we must take a few moments to explore the fish symbolism that is seen on this cylinder seal. What makes this fish symbolism so important is that it provides us with one of the few remaining connections that help identify the Lord God of the Bible in relation to the other mythologies, especially the Greek mythology we've been using right now. As we have learned, the great Lord of Light is also the Greek god known as Zeus, who is also traditionally thought of as Lucifer within the monotheistic religions. But as you know, there are two other primary gods within Greek mythology that could stand as equal with mighty Zeus: Poseidon, the mighty lord of the waters, and Hades, the powerful lord of the underworld. It is this fish symbolism or water symbolism that connects the Lord God of the Bible to the legendary gods of the water or seas, primarily Poseidon of Greek mythology. This connection to the fish and water symbolism is still used to this day within the Catholic Church and Christianity as a whole, where the most obvious example of this ancient fish symbolism is in the vestments that the Pope of Rome wears. One of the most notable and striking elements of the fish symbolism is reflected in the Pope's hat or mitre. This is the traditional ceremonial headdress of both the Pope and certain bishops. On closer inspection, you will discover that it is the same fish vestments that we see within this cylinder seal. It is in fact a modern, mystical, symbolic version of the fish head we see on this cylinder seal. We will take a closer look at this mystical fish water symbolism and its connection to the Lord God of the Bible as we continue to go deeper within the dream vision. What is important to note at this point is that this is the first symbolic connection to the Lord God of the Bible with this fish water symbolism. This brings us to the third and final major god within the context of Greek mythology, Hades, Lord of the Underworld. This is one of the best examples of how the female goddess faction has been removed from the overall story and replaced with a male character, as we have touched upon in previous videos. Another similar traditional myths that have the same basic arrangement of three gods, normally one for the sky, one for the waters, and one for the underworld. The Lord of the Underworld was originally a woman, with the mythology of the Norsemen or Vikings being the most familiar in the Western world. In Norse mythology, the Lord of the Underworld is the goddess Hel, the ruler of Hellenum, the realm of the dead. It also gives us a small insight how this goddess faction may have been viewed as being important to the overall balance of society and life, but not the major player that can control the other gods. This is also a subject we will explore more as we go farther along into our journey into the mystical symbolism. The next to final piece we will examine before moving on to the next part of the story is the 10 small dots that we saw on the first cylinder seal, as you can see here again. In the upper right and left sides of the seal, you can see that there are two sets of 5 dots on each side. What makes these 10 little dots important is that they represent the Pleiades cluster of stars that is in the constellation Taurus the Bull. What is important at this moment is that you need to make a special note of this configuration. It's also important to note that we see the 10 stars here and not the more traditional 7 stars that most are familiar with. Additionally, as with the fish water symbolism, you will begin to understand why this small little cluster of stars is so very important as we continue our journey deeper into the mystical symbolism of the dream vision and the cylinder seals. All of this allows us to understand the symbolic relationship and importance of the calendars and zodiacs and the connections to the gods. They were simply used to keep track of when the mighty gods of heaven would come down from this great abode of the gods and stand upon their lofty towers and receive the resources provided by their human slaves, which were presented as offerings and sacrifices during great rituals and ceremonies that our ancient ancestors performed for the gods. Zodiacs appear to be keeping track of the actual animals or items that the gods required as offerings for when they returned each month and stood upon their towers of power. We will be looking much deeper at these towers as we go farther into the story. If you like this video, please hit the like button below and don't forget to subscribe for future videos.